to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the July 10, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Angelo Di Grazia here from the Space Association of Australia, and I'm on my own this week, just like Mike Collins orbiting the moon during the Apollo 11 moonwalk, to deliver this week's exciting episode of Space News. So let's get started. Let's go to Australian space. A NASA official said Australia's year-old space agency will need more resources to thrive. Badri Yunus, a senior official with NASA's Space Communications Program, met with the Australian Space Agency last week and discussed potential collaborations in technology. Yunus said that after the meeting that it was about time Australia got its own space agency, but that it needs many additional resources from the government to move forward. And, oh, by the way, happy birthday, Australian Space Agency, 1 year this week. Over to New Zealand. Rocket Lab launched 7 satellites last week on a mission for the Seattle-based payload aggregator company, Spaceflight. Rocket Lab's Electron rocket lifted off early morning last week and successfully released the 7 satellites into low Earth orbit. The payloads included Black Sky's Global 3 imaging satellite, a smaller Satellites for Swarm Technologies, US Special Operations Command, an undisclosed customer, and as reported in last week's Space News, our very own University of Melbourne's Melbourne Space Program, ACRUX-1 CubeSat. Congratulations to Melbourne Space Program. Great effort. The launch was the third this year for Rocket Lab, which is seeking to reach a monthly launch rate this year, but has not disclosed the customer or schedule for its next mission. Over to US space policy. President Trump predicted America would land humans on Mars someday soon in his 4th of July speech. Trump, after noting the upcoming 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 and in the presence of Flight Director Gene Kranz among the guests at the Lincoln Memorial speech, said, "Gene, I want you to know that we're going to be back in the moon very soon, and someday soon we will plant the American flag on Mars." Trump also mentioned Gus Grissom and Buzz Aldrin in the address. His comments come less than a month after, in a tweet, he appeared to criticise NASA for emphasising a return to the moon rather than human missions to Mars. Over to Space Launch System Orion. NASA performs a successful in-flight test of the Orion spacecraft's abort system. A refurbished Peacekeeper booster motor carrying a boilerplate Orion capsule and its launch abort system lifted off from Cape Canaveral's Space Launch Complex 46 early morning last week. The Ascent Abort Mission 2 was launched to an altitude of nearly 10 kilometres and a speed of Mach 1.3. The launch abort system was then triggered and fired for 55 seconds to pull away the Orion capsule before being jettisoned, demonstrating its ability to do so during a max Q conditions on an SLS launch. The abort system, whose development dates back to the Constellation program more than a decade ago, performed a pad abort test in 2010. NASA said immediately after the test that it appeared to go as planned. NASA says the Orion program is on track to support the goal of returning humans to the moon by 2024 after the recent Ascent abort test. Program officials said that the recent test was a success and that early reviews of the data showed that the launch abort system performed as expected. Prior to the test, the program manager for Orion said that he believed the program would be ready to send astronauts to the moon in 2024, with hardware for 3 separate spacecraft currently in various stages of production. However, tests of the Orion for the Artemis 1 mission has slipped from a schedule NASA provided a little more than a month ago by about a month. Over to the moon. NASA announced last week the selection of 12 payloads that it will fly to the moon on commercial landers. The science and technology payloads proposed by teams outside of NASA include a small rover, a robotic arm, cameras and other instruments. The payloads will be flown on future missions by companies under the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program. To NASA Planetary. NASA says engineers and scientists now have a clear view of a Mars instrument stuck just below the surface. Spacecraft controllers completed late last week the process of removing the cover for the InSight Mars Lander's heat flow instrument, whose probe is stuck just below the surface. The images show that a pit has formed around the probe's mole that is keeping it from gaining traction as it tries to hammer into the surface. Engineers are considering using the lander's robotic arm to press on the surface by the mole to see if that can collapse the pit and allow the mole to regain traction. Over to US Air Force and military news. A Defence Department procurement could be the first step towards a military space station. The Defence Innovation Unit released a solicitation last week for an orbital outpost, which it described as a small module that could be used for the various types of research. Reminds me of the US Air Force MOL program of the mid-60s, which also was slated for research purposes. That solicitation included as potential future capabilities the ability to support docking by robotic and crewed spacecraft as well as human rating. The director of the Defence Innovation Unit Space Directorate said that the purpose of the module is to support autonomous activities, including in-space manufacturing and assembly, but didn't want to rule out non-traditional or disruptive approaches by companies, including those proposing commercial space station modules. With a decline in launch activity, Vandenberg Air Force Base is looking to attract new businesses to its launch sites. Launches by the two major companies that use the base, SpaceX and ULA, are now few and far between, and base officials now say they're looking to bring in new customers like Firefly Aerospace. Firefly will convert a Delta II pad for use by their Alpha launch vehicle. Range officials have also been in discussions with small launch providers, Relativity Space, Vector and Rocket Lab, although none has yet made any commitments. The base is looking at options to turn Space Launch Complex 6, the pad currently used by the Delta IV, into a multi-user facility that could support companies like Blue Origin or Northrop Grumman. Over to Europe. ESA suffered a setback in the development of its ExoMars 2020 mission when parachutes were damaged in a recent test. The agency said that during a high-altitude test of the parachute system for the lander in late May, the two main parachutes were torn in several places, although they still achieved a good level of the expected aerodynamic drag. Engineers will investigate the cause of the tears and plan to reinforce the parachutes before additional tests planned for later this year. ExoMars 2020 is scheduled for launch next July, landing a rover on Mars the following March. To Russia. Roscosmos has created a new design bureau devoted to reusable launch vehicle technology. The bureau, named after Italian-born Soviet aircraft designer Roberto Bettini, will operate as part of the Central Research Institute of Machine Building. The focus of the Bureau will be on a concept for a wing reusable rocket stage called Krylo SV. To China. China's Yaotu 2 lunar rover has had to overcome some communications issues that hindered its operations. According to a Chinese Yaotu 2 driving diary published in late June, the rover had suffered issues during its sixth lunar day of operations, which caused interference with communications between the Yaotu 2 rover and the QKO relay satellite, including a loss of telemetry and contact with the rover. Analysis indicated an error caused by a cosmic ray striking a rover microchip, and the issue was resolved successfully. Yaotu 2 has passed its design lifetime of 3 months, but one Chinese official expressed hopes late March that the rover can operate for at least 1 year. China has released new rules for its growing commercial launch industry. The document released last month outlines rules for the research, development, testing of launch vehicles, safety, confidentiality and export control, interaction with launch sites, dealing with propellants, as well as listing supporting laws and regulations for China's space activities. The formulation of guidelines has largely been a top-down process by the Chinese government, with no indication of involvement of commercial space actors. At least 20 commercial launch-related companies have been established in China, and a representative of one of them said the new rules were welcomed. To India. The Indian Space Agency ISRO has signed an agreement with a Russian organisation for astronaut training. The agreement with Glav Cosmos, announced last week, covers services such as consulting on astronaut selection processes, medical examinations and training of selected astronauts. Terms of the deal were not disclosed. India plans to fly 3 people on its first crewed mission no later than 2022. India has set a July 15 launch date for its next lunar mission. The launch of the Chandrayaan-2 mission is scheduled for the early morning hours of July 15 on a GSLV Mark III rocket. India will attempt to become the 4th country to soft land on the moon and cementing its place among the world's spacefaring nations. The mission aims to deliver a rover to an elevated plane close to the uncharted lunar South Pole on September 6 or 7 and investigate the surface for signs of water and potentially new sources of energy. Chandrayaan means moon vehicle in Sanskrit, and it exemplifies the resurgence of international interest in space. It's one step in an envisioned progression that includes putting a space station in orbit and eventually landing a crew on the moon. The moon race is certainly on. Okay, let's go to Israel. Space IL's decision not to pursue a second lunar lander mission is only the latest sign of delays or redirection among former Google Lunar X Prize teams outside the US. Space IL said last month that, contrary to statements made immediately after the crash landing of its Beresheet lander in April, it would not develop a second lunar lander. Space IL hasn't elaborated on what it will do in place of a lunar lander. Team Indus has also backed away from plans to fly a lunar lander it developed for the competition, instead providing support for Orbit Beyond, a US-based company that is part of NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. PT Scientists, which said last year it would launch its lunar lander in late 2019 or 2020, now says it won't fly until at least the latter half of 2021. To commercial space. A test flight of Exos Aerospace's reusable Saudi rocket didn't go as planned recently, although the company did recover the rocket. The Sarge sounding rocket lifted off from Spaceport America in New Mexico and appeared to lose altitude control seconds later. Controllers were able to restore control and abort the mission, and the rocket descended back to Earth under a parachute to a landing within sight of the launch pad. The launch was the third for Sarge, and Exos hoped a successful mission which would allow it to proceed to commercial operations and press ahead with the development of an orbital launch vehicle. To SpaceX. A SpaceX executive says the company could perform the first commercial mission using its next-generation Starship vehicle as soon as 2021. At a recent conference, Jonathan Hoffler, SpaceX's Vice President of Commercial Sales, said the company is in discussions with 3 prospective customers, all telecom companies, to fly on the first commercial mission in 2021. He said more test flights of the Starship vehicle are planned for the coming months, including the possibility of orbital flight. The full stack, which includes the Super Heavy booster, won't be ready for test flights until next year. The company is, in the meantime, continuing to expand the reuse of its Falcon 9 rocket with the goal of reusing a single Falcon 9 first stage at least 5 or even 6 times this year. And finally, a Dutch startup has backed away from bizarre plans to deliver the first baby in space. Space Life Origin said last Northern Fall that it planned a series of missions that included one where a pregnant woman would be launched into space to deliver a baby in orbit. Last month, the company replaced the content of its website with a message from its CEO that those plans were on hold because of ethical, safety, and medical concerns with those missions. Well, there you go. Okay, well, that's all we have for this week's Space News, and it's back to you, Andrew.